Good morning, my friends. This is Tyra Jarvis coming to you with Transformation Tuesday. I come to you live every week at 8 a.m. Pacific time with topics related to transformation and growth. And I'm representing my company, Kefi Coaching, and I love what I do. And I'm just here every morning to chime in on whatever's top of mind and whatever's going on. And I'm glad that you're here. So what I wanted to share today is I've always had a real fascination with history and a passion for it. And I believe legacy is really important, whatever role we play, the people that we influence in our lifetime, as well as the people that have influenced us in their lifetime. And so March is National Women's History Month. And I thought I would take a little bit of time to talk about why that's important to me and some of my involvements with the organization, the National Women's History Museum. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that if you're interested, but I'll share with you some links if you happen to be interested in it as well. And I think what's important to know is that we celebrate National Women's History Month every March, and it's a big deal. And it started in 1980 when President Carter actually started National Women's History Week. And that went on for a while, and then it was later, there were actually congressional involvement to make it National Women's History Month. But this quote from Carter, I think, is pretty significant. So he says, "From the first settlers who came to our shores, from the first American Indian families who befriended them, men and women have worked together to build this nation. Too often the women were unsung and sometimes their contributions were unnoticed. But the achievements, leadership, courage, strength, and love of the women who built America was as vital as that of the men whose names we know so well." And that was his proclamation to start Women's History Week, which has since become Women's History Month. And the National Women's History Alliance determines the theme every year. And last year was a pretty significant year. It would have been the 100th anniversary. It was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women earning the right to vote in our country. Not too long ago, 1920. And they decided that the theme for this year, let me just make sure I get it right. The theme for this year would continue on, given that 2020 was, some of the celebrations were interrupted because of the pandemic, but it was Valiant Women of the Vote refusing to be silenced. And so, why is it so important to celebrate women's history? Well, first of all, it builds on the foundations of the past. I think that's relevant. It also encourages self-esteem, establishes positive role models, living and those that have gone before us. It teaches about leadership and activism and courage of the women, and women can actually see what's possible. So you're hearing a lot, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And all of us kind of get social and cultural cues about what's possible. The focus around the first woman vice president and African-American vice president. So it allows both genders to see that gender is not the deciding factor in what you can do, in what someone can do. And, I first learned of the National Women's History Museum in 2010. I was in Washington, D.C. I was advocating for them as part of their annual conference. And I heard one of the original senators, I believe it was Senator McCluskey, she was advocating for everybody to get involved in the National Women's History, project and then follow and support the National Women's History Museum. So if you're interested, you'd want to go to nwhm.org. There's a ton of information up there. I just realized there was a whole calendar for the month with incredible articles and incredible stories for every day on what you could learn about women today as well as women in the past. So it's very, very well done. They've actually existed virtually for over 25 years. educating teachers and parents about women's history and looking to capture the stories because they don't exist. If we don't write them now, if this generation doesn't make sure that these stories get written, they're not going to be written. And this statistic was pretty incredible because, as President Carter mentioned, women's contributions and accomplishments for most of the part of our history has been overlooked and consequently omitted from the mainstream American culture. So here's a couple of facts for you. 1 in 10 figures in modern history books are women. You know, and each time a girl opens a book and reads a womanless history, she learns that she's worth less. So how much of the equity gap it's deep-seated in some of these images and us really owning and celebrating the contributions, and many of the ones that we don't know. 15 out of 217 statues in the U.S. Capitol building. Less than 8% of statues in national parks are women. And there's 17,000 museums in the U.S., and not one of them includes the roles and contributions of women building the nation. So, I mean, some of the stories that are available that are pretty profound and pretty incredible are just some of the ones that I learned. For instance, in 1777, a young girl by the name of Sybil Lundgren, she was 16 years old at the time. She was a patriot. She actually rode approximately 40 miles, which was twice as long as Paul Revere, to alert the New York militia that the British were coming, but we've never heard about her. And I love the Hedy Lamarr story because Hedy Lamarr was an actress, you know, one of the early actresses, and she was gorgeous. There was no question about it. And she had real success in film, but she was a scientist. She viewed herself as a scientist. And she and a partner invented the frequency hopping technology that's used today on cell phones, Wi-Fi's, and GPS. And it was turned down by the military. Who knows why? But it's now relevant today. And she's attributed to that success. I think the other thing, and it's been a long time since I've been to the Smithsonian, but the American History Museum and the Smithsonian, the only female dedicated exhibits are the First Lady inaugural dresses, and don't get me wrong, I love those, and Julia Child's kitchen. But come on, between all walks of life, whether it's science, architecture, the military, the women at home, with the war efforts, there are incredible women in sports. There are incredible contributions of women from the beginning of time until now. And it's time for us to recognize those and celebrate them and teach our children those. You know, so one of the stories that I was really moved by was about the portrait museum, portrait monument, because I didn't know much about it. And so the portrait monument was a statue of Lucretia Mott, Katie Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, and it was carved by a woman right after the 19th Amendment was passed, a lady by the name of Adelaide Johnson. And it was presented at the Capitol Rotunda in 1921, 6 months after the 19th Amendment was ratified. The very next day, it was moved underground, and Congress ordered that the inscription be scraped off. And it was moved to the Capitol crypt. It was, and it stayed there. Now, I did a little bit of Google search around that, and unfortunately, the public sentiment was they didn't want to celebrate the 19th Amendment. And unfortunately, I'm a little embarrassed to say that many of the women of the time felt that the ladies were not attractive. They were homely, and they didn't want that up there. Well, in 1997, the organization that I'm affiliated with, the National Women's History Museum, they raised $1 million of their own money to actually pay for the project to get it up into the rotunda where it sits today. So at least today, if and when we get to go to the Capitol, you'll see this statue called the Portrait Monument, and it's sitting in the rotunda as a result of the National Women's History Museum. And we have started, you know, since 2014, this organization has been lobbying to not only exist virtually, but to exist and actually have a physical museum. And in 2014, again, they raised the money to have a bipartisan commission do a feasibility study that there would be a women's history museum and that it would exist on the DC Mall with all the other museums, and that it would take its place, and that there would be a showcasing of all the contributions of women in a physical space that we could all visit. And that bipartisan commission passed, and then there were bills before both houses of Congress, and I'm really pleased to say that those bills passed late last year. And what that means is Congress has decided there will be a museum, but now the challenge begins. We've got to raise the money. And the fact remains that when the African American Museum had their congressional bills, it took them 10 years, as I understand it, to raise the capital funds needed to build the museum. So we want to look to doing what we can do to support that. So I encourage you to support the National Women's History Museum. Go to nwhm.org. Consider being a donor. Consider helping to spread the word. Learn about women's history. Embrace women's history. Today, and I was thrilled to look that the Fab Five, Stacey Abrams is listed. They've got a great bio on her and the role that she's played in our current lifetime. So it's living history as well as, past history. So, really get out there and look at what you can do to support this incredible organization. And, you would say, why a museum? Do we need another museum? Well, first of all, there isn't one that exists that dedicates the contributions of women. But this Meryl Streep quote really says it all right? Why a museum? Because buildings are important, not only as symbols, but as gathering places, as inspirational spaces. Museums are especially important in Washington, D.C., the seat of our nation's heritage, memorialized in marble and granite, glass and steel. But there is no Women's History Museum in Washington. There's a postal museum, there's a spy museum, there's a crime and punishment museum, there's a national bonsai museum, and there's a building that is a museum of buildings. But there's no Women's History Museum. So, just think of all the women that you've been able to observe and model and learn from today, whether you agree with them politically or not. We have women leaders at all times in front of us. It could be our mothers, our family members, and it's caused me this past week to reflect on the influences from my family. And I'm going to be talking more about that next week, but I'm a child of immigrants, Swedish immigrants and Greek immigrants. And most of my ancestors, my female ancestors were single moms, and they worked. And I think about, I knew nothing different. And I look at the things that I learned from them, whether it was growth and courage and adventure and serving others and helping others. And I'm just really proud of my ancestors. And I would encourage you to look at yours as well. We'll talk more about that next week. Anyway, become a member. Urge your elected officials to help fund this congressional bill. And follow the National Women's History Museum on NWHM on social media. And if you belong to an organization, become an affiliate of the National Women's History Museum. And let's really get this built and be able to enjoy these celebrations of these incredible women. When you are a charter member, the materials that they send out to you are so informative. And they usually have something featured every month, and they've done a lot of research, and they see it as their job to tell these stories, because if we don't tell them and we don't get them written and we don't rewrite the American history book to include women, the young girls and young women that follow us are never going to know these incredible stories. So help us do this. All right. So listen, thanks for joining, Lori. Hope you're having a great week. Let's embrace our women's history and our legacy and help each other with that. All right. So you have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.